The HR manager handed my son his termination letter the same morning he'd mocked me for never amounting to much without college. Name's Hank Foster, 58, small business owner. The hum of the office AC felt colder than usual as I fingered the gold pen my father left me. Ever been blindsided by family pride? Tell me below. There's a particular kind of quiet in an old farmhouse on an autumn morning, the kind where you can hear the furnace click on the faint groan of pipes, the hum that reminds you the cold is just on the other side of the walls. I had just finished my first cup of coffee, the mug still warm between my palms, when I rose to rinse it at the sink. That's when I heard it. Marley Joe's voice floated in from the kitchen, crisp and matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. Silas, you know, he's just the old wallet, right? We keep him around for convenience. I froze. My fingers tightened around the handle of the mug, knuckles whitening as I fought the urge to step into the room. The words weren't meant for my ears, of that I was certain, but the house with its creaks and open archways doesn't keep secrets well. Silas gave a weak chuckle, the kind that says he wanted no part of the conversation but didn't have the backbone to challenge it. I imagined him shifting uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck like he did when he was nervous. I stood in the hallway for a long second, unseen, the weight of her words settling on my chest, like the first heavy frost on a field, the kind that means whatever's left out overnight won't survive the morning. I stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and returned to my den. My den, it was the one room in the house that still felt like mine. The walls were lined with shelves of old ledgers, photo frames tarnished at the edges, and the battered recliner I'd refused to part with when Nadine updated the furniture. I sank into the chair and reached, as I often did when I needed grounding, for my father's silver pocket watch. It had been his graduation gift, handed down to me when I took my first real job back, when I believed hard work alone was enough to earn respect. The watch was cool against my palm, heavy in a way that reminded me of duty, of promises made to men long gone. I thumbed it open, watching the second hand tick steady, the glass face catching the light from the lamp beside me. My coffee sat untouched on the side table, steam, now a memory. I thought of last Sunday's dinner, how Marley wouldn't quite meet my eyes as she served the roast, how her napkin was folded and refolded until the cloth softened at the crease. I should have seen this coming. The words she'd said, the old wallet echoed. It wasn't anger that rose in me, at least not the hot kind. It was something colder, deeper. I wasn't about to make a scene or storm into the kitchen demanding apologies. That's not my way. Instead, I sat feeling the cold of the watch's metal seep into my skin, anchoring me. Not for long, Marls, I whispered to no one but myself. The house creaked as the furnace kicked on again, and I could hear the faint murmur of their conversation continuing. I didn't want to listen, but the words filtered in like smoke under a door. You think we should go ahead and talk to the lawyer about putting the house in just your name? Marley's voice again, practical, efficient, like she was discussing a budget or a grocery list. For paperwork, she added. Easier that way. Cleaner. Silas didn't answer right away. I could almost picture him, jaw-tight, eyes darting to the hallway, wondering if I was near. His silence was louder than any words he might have offered. I closed the watch, the click of the latch sharp in the quiet room. Outside, frost edged along the corners of the window, the early light turning it silver. My gaze drifted to the coffee on the table, now cold and forgotten. A thought settled in, clear, resolute. I wouldn't confront them today. No, I'd observe, I'd listen. And when the time was right, I'd act not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because an old wallet might be worn, might be overlooked, but it still holds value. And sometimes it's the old wallet that holds the key to everything people think they own. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly. I stayed in my den, the hum of the furnace my companion. From time to time, I heard the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dishes, Marley's clipped tones carrying through the thin walls. Silas's voice was softer, harder to make out, like he was trying to keep the peace in a conversation already tipped toward war. I traced the engraving on the back of the pocket watch with my thumb, my father's initials worn, but legible. A reminder of steadier times, of promises kept, of legacies not so easily erased. By late morning, they'd gone out errands, I assumed. The house felt emptier in their absence, but the weight of their words remained. I stretched the stiffness from my shoulders, and glanced once more at the cold coffee. Then I carried the cup to the sink, rinsed it clean, and set it down carefully, as if order in small things might bring clarity to larger ones. The frost had begun to melt outside, droplets tracing slow paths down the glass. I watched them for a while, mind turning over the next steps I'd need to take. Quietly, carefully. That was how these things were done. And in the hush of the house, the watch's steady tick reminded me time wasn't done with me yet. Their voices echoed in my head long after the house had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that settles heavy on old walls at night when even the ticking of a clock feels intrusive. I sat in my study, the small desk lamp casting a pool of yellow light onto papers I hadn't touched in years. The air smelled of old paper and cedar, the comforting scent of history of things built to last. Outside, the snow had started again. I could see it collecting on the driveway, soft and unhurried, like it had all the time in the world to blanket us in white. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out the thick file folders I'd avoided for too long. The edges were soft, worn down from the years. Some labels had faded to near illegibility. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from what I knew I'd find inside. I laid them out one by one. The first folder held my father's old PTA finance reports, ink faded, his signature still clear at the bottom of each. A reminder of the legacy. He left one of integrity, of service, of keeping your word even when no one was watching. The second folder was heavier, thicker. It contained the papers from when I added Silas's name to the deed. I remembered the pride that day, the sense that I was doing right by my boy, securing his future. My fingers brushed over the notary's stamp, the embossed seal, faint beneath the layers of time. I set that file aside and powered up the old printer, the hum filling the room like a small engine coming to life. I dug into my email, heart sinking as I reread messages I'd skimmed too quickly before. Marley's tone polite, measured but firm. Discussing options with our family lawyer without so much as a mention to me. I printed them out, each sheet warm from the machine, the ink still smelling sharp and new. The pile grew, correspondence about refinancing, about streamlining ownership, about what was best for the family. Not once did she use my name. I was the current owner, the elder party. The snow continued to fall, the world beyond the window disappearing inch by inch. I rose and crossed to the safe, retrieved a fresh folder, and labeled it in my steady hand, House Deed. I slid the printed emails inside, along with copies of the old deed papers. The folder felt heavier than it should. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the safe's empty interior, its black metal walls cold and unfeeling. Then, with a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than my lungs, I placed the folder inside and closed the door with a soft click. The printer hummed again, one last page I hadn't realized I'd queued. I picked it up and my stomach knotted as I read the header, Draft Proposal Transfer of Ownership. My eyes went to the bottom of the page where Marley's name sat, typed neat and final as if it belonged there. The edges of the paper crinkled beneath my grip. I set it down carefully, smoothing it out, and reached for the phone. My fingers hovered over Amos's number before I pressed call. He answered on the third ring, voice warm despite the hour. Lem, everything okay? I kept my tone light, but he knew me too well not to hear the weight behind it. Coffee soon? Could use a friend's ear. Of course, he said without hesitation. Tomorrow morning I'll buy. We exchanged a few pleasantries, the kind men our age use to skirt around the real reason we call. When I hung up, the house felt emptier, but my resolve steadier. I turned back to the desk, collected the printed emails into a neat stack, and slid them into the folder. The reports, the deed, the emails, they were more than paper. They were the story of trust, given trust misplaced, and trust I'd have to reclaim. The snow had stopped when I finally stood at the window again, the world outside still and white. The night held its breath, and so did I. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, letting in a burst of winter air that smelled of snow and distant chimney smoke. The diner was just as I remembered it, booths patched with duct tape, a counter with chrome worn dull from decades of elbows, and that familiar lingering scent of burnt toast and strong coffee. It was comforting in a way that only places untouched by time can be. Amos was already there, settled into a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug. He nodded as I slid into the seat across from him. "Morning, Lem," he said. Voice steady, the kind of voice that made you feel steadier just hearing it. "Morning," I shrugged off my coat. Let it fall beside me on the vinyl seat. Outside, the sky was the kind of gray that promised snow before day's end. Inside, the diner's hum of conversation and clatter of plates felt like a shield against the cold world beyond the fogged windows. Amos fiddled with something in his hand, and I realized it was his pocket watch, old well-kept, the twin of my own. The sight of it made my fingers stray to mine, hidden in my vest pocket, as if the two timepieces shared some unspoken bond just as we did. The waitress brought fresh coffee, setting it down with a soft clink that seemed louder in the hush between us. We didn't speak right away. Some conversations don't start with words. Finally, Amos broke the silence. "You look like a man carrying more than his share today." I gave a half smile, one that didn't reach my eyes. "Maybe I am." He didn't push, just waited, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, the spoon tapping soft against the side of the mug in a steady rhythm that matched the ticking of our watches. "I heard something I wasn't meant to hear," I said at last, the words tasting bitter as I spoke them. I told him about Marley's comment, the old wallet, and Silas's silence. Amos listened, didn't interrupt. When I finished, he took a long sip of coffee, then set the mug down gently. "Lem," he said, leaning in, "your worth isn't tied to a deed or a title. You know that, right?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed it, not fully. We talked then about our fathers, the lessons they'd tried to teach us, the ones we'd learned too late. About the weight of a name, the weight of a house, the weight of expectations that sometimes felt heavier than both combined. I pulled out my watch, set it on the table between us. The chain coiled like a silver snake, the face catching the diner's weak light. "Feels like the respect cracked somewhere along the way," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Amos picked it up, turned it over in his broad hands, studying the engraving as if it held answers. "Respect can crack," sure, he said, "but it can be mended. Question is, how will you mend it?" He gripped my shoulder, then firm, reassuring. "Set the line, Lem. Do it with grace. You'll sleep better for it." I nodded again, this time with a little more certainty. We sat a while longer, talking of small things. Whether the high school team's losing streak, how the new pastor was settling in. Comforting talk, the kind that eases the transition from hard truths to everyday life. Before we parted, I jotted down an appointment time with the lawyer on a napkin, the pen scratched loud in my ears. The decision felt heavy, but necessary. I left the diner with the watch's chain loose in my pocket, its weight a reminder that time keeps moving whether we're ready or not. The first snowflakes began to fall as I stepped into the cold, melting on my cheek, leaving no trace. Sunday supper had always been a tradition, though lately it felt more like an obligation wrapped in stale pleasantries. That evening, the dining room seemed colder than usual, despite the furnace doing its best. The single bulb above the table flickered now and then, casting shadows that shifted like uneasy thoughts. Outside, the wind howled against the storm windows, rattling them in their frames as if nature itself wanted to chime in on what was about to unfold. We'd barely made it through the blessing when Marley slid the papers across the table. The stack of forms, neat, heavy, deliberate. "We should just formalize it, Lem," she said, her voice as crisp as the edge of the papers themselves. The audacity of it froze the room. My fork midway to my mouth hung in the air for a moment before I set it down carefully beside my plate. The whiff of the casserole, burnt at the edges where it had clung to the dish, seemed suddenly sharp, intrusive. Nadine, standing behind me with the water pitcher, hesitated, her fingers trembling just enough to send droplets onto the tablecloth. Our eyes met for a heartbeat, hers full of silent warning or maybe quiet pleading. She filled my glass and stepped back, hands clasped together, watching. Silas cleared his throat but said nothing. His eyes darted between Marley and me, shoulders tense as if bracing for impact. I looked at each of them in turn, let the silence do its work. Then, voice steady, I said the only word I needed. No, the words settled in the space between us, heavier than the forms on the table. Marley's smile, tight practiced, didn't reach her eyes. "Lem, it's just paperwork. It simplifies things. Makes sense, really. We're only thinking of what's best for the family." I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of its legs loud in the hush. As I rose, my hand brushed my vest pocket, and the watch slipped free. It hit the hardwood with a sharp crack, the sound slicing through the moment like a blade. The watch lay face up, its glass, spiderwebbed with fractures, the tiny second hand stuttering in its circle. The tick faltered uneven now, like a heartbeat struggling to find its rhythm. No one moved. The clatter of a fork dropping onto a plate echoed as Silas's hand slipped. Even Marley looked shaken for just a second before gathering herself. I bent, picked up the watch, gently feeling the jagged edge of the cracked glass against my palm. The weight of it was familiar, but altered like me, I supposed. Changed by what had fallen apart. Tomorrow, I said quietly, I'm filing my own paperwork at the county office. The wind outside rose to a howl, the windows trembling in their frames. Inside the house held its breath, and so did we. The meal went untouched, cooling on our plates, the smell of burnt edges mingling with the sharp tang of things unsaid. The county office smelled faintly of old paper, stale coffee, and cleaning solution. Fluorescent lights flickered above, humming in that way that seems to set your teeth on edge if you listen too long. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the weak shafts of sunlight sneaking past faded blinds. I stood at the counter, pen in hand, heart steady in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. The form before me was simple in its language, clinical, even just words on paper, but words that drew a line I could no longer avoid. The clerk, a woman about my age with weary eyes, glanced up at me over her glasses. When I hesitated for just a breath, she offered a tight, understanding smile. Been a lot of that lately, she murmured as if to reassure me I wasn't the only one making hard decisions these days. I didn't respond, just nodded slightly, pressed the pen to the page, and signed my name in careful strokes. The moment the ink dried, I felt something uncoil inside me, like I'd set down a burden I didn't realize I'd been carrying on my shoulders. The clerk took the form, checked it over with practiced efficiency, and reached for the heavy stamp. The thump of it hitting the paper echoed in my ears, louder than it should have been. Final, no going back. Here's your copy, she said, sliding the papers toward me. I took them with hands that trembled just enough to notice as I buttoned my coat. As I stepped out into the sunlight, it felt harsher than I remembered. The kind of light that doesn't flatter, that exposes every crack in the sidewalk, every smudge on the glass. But it was honest, and after the shadows of the last few months, I welcomed the honesty. My phone buzzed before I even reached my truck. I glanced at the screen, Silas. I let it ring once, twice before answering. Dad, what did you do? His voice was tight, urgent, like he already knew the answer and hoped somehow he was wrong. I took care of what needed taking care of, I said simply. There was a pause. I could hear Marley's voice in the background, sharp, insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. Please, Silas said, quieter now. Let's talk before you do anything else. We'll talk, I promised, but not today. I ended the call, ignoring the immediate ping of a text from Marley. Another, then another, each one no doubt filled with demands or justifications. I didn't look. Instead, I slid the cracked pocket watch from my vest, turned it over in my hand. The fracture on the face caught the sunlight, scattering it in small broken patterns onto the dashboard. I held it for a long moment, feeling its weight, the smooth coolness of the metal. Then with care, I slid it back into my pocket. The decision was made. The line was drawn. That evening, after the sun had dipped low and the world outside the windows turned blue with twilight, the mail came. Among the usual flyers and bills was a letter from the bank addressed in Marley's handwriting, though I doubted she meant for me to see it. I opened it with steady hands, unfolding the paper to read the formal notice. The words were dry, but their meaning clear. She'd tried to remortgage the property before my paperwork had gone through, tried to make it theirs on paper before I could stop it. I set the letter down on the kitchen table, the house around me silent except for the faint creak of settling wood and the soft tick of the damaged watch on the counter beside me. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches, and I stood there a long while, watching their shadows dance against the walls, knowing the real storm had only just begun. Dad, please, can we talk? Silas's voice cracked through the phone, worn thin by worry, and maybe, just maybe, regret. It was the kind of voice a man uses when he's run out of rehearsed speeches and is left with only the truth he didn't want to face. I sat in the living room, the last of the day's sunlight spilling through the window, catching the dust in the air like gold flecks suspended in honey. The hearth glowed with a small fire not needed for heat on this early summer evening, but comforting in its own way. Outside, the birds sang their evening chorus, their calls mingling with the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Nadine's words from the night before echoed in my mind, soft as a prayer. "Don't burn it all down, Lem," she'd whispered as she drew the quilt up over me, her hand resting on my shoulder, for just a moment longer than needed. "I'm listening now," I told Silas. "Come over. We'll talk, just us." They arrived before the light was gone, their car crunching the gravel in the drive doors shutting with hesitant thuds that seemed louder than they should in the quiet. I watched from the porch as they made their way up Silas, looking like he carried a weight he didn't know how to set down. Marley composed but guarded, as if bracing for a storm she wasn't sure would come. Nadine opened the door before they could knock, offering a small smile that asked for peace, even as it welcomed them in. We settled in the living room, the kind of room where too many memories lingered in the worn armchairs and the faded patterns of the rug. Silas perched on the edge of the sofa, Marley beside him, arms folded tightly, her gaze fixed on a spot somewhere near the mantel. I stayed in my chair, the one that had been mine since the day we moved into the house, its arms polished smooth by the years. No lawyers, no papers. I began, voice steady. "Just words, and I hope we'll use them wisely." Silas nodded, swallowing hard, but I held up a hand before he could speak. "I need to lay out where I stand. I'm not here to punish or humiliate. I'm here to be clear." The fire cracked softly, the sound small but steady. I expect respect. I expect honesty. And I expect that if we're going to have any kind of relationship worth the name, it's going to be built on those things, not on schemes whispered behind doors or plans drawn up in the dark. Marley's lips parted as if to argue, but Silas reached out, rested his hand over hers, and shook his head, just a little. She hesitated, then let the words die unspoken. "I'm sorry, Dad." Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was doing what was right for Marley, for the kids, for all of us. But I see what it cost." I nodded and let the quiet fill the room, the way water fills a hollow and makes it whole again. When they left, the evening air felt cooler, gentler somehow. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the last light clinging to the horizon like a promise. I watched their car disappear down the lane, the taillights winking out at the bend. The next morning, I walked the short distance to Main Street, the cracked watch heavy in my pocket, its broken face pressing against my palm. I stepped into the repair shop, the bell above the door chiming soft and familiar. Mr. Cray looked up from his workbench, his glasses sliding down his nose. His hands, though lined with age, were steady as stone. "Ah, Lem," he said, seeing what I held. "About time, huh?" I smiled, small but genuine. "Yeah. Time it was mended." He took the watch from me as if it were something precious, and in that moment it was. Later, as I sat on the porch, Amos called. His voice carried the warmth of old friendship across the miles and years. "Lem, the church board wants you to speak at the fall meeting. Folks around here noticed the way you've handled yourself. They say we could use more of that backbone." I stared out at the fields, the breeze carrying the scent of wild flowers and fresh-cut grass. I reached for the newspaper beside me, scrawled the meeting date in the margin with Nadine's kitchen pen. "Tell them I'll be there," I said, my voice sure. And for the first time in a long while, I felt sure too. I didn't expect folks to care this much. I told Amos as we stood on the church steps, watching the last of the congregation drift toward their cars. The early fall breeze tugged at my coat, carrying with it the crisp smell of leaves and wood smoke. Maple leaves skittered across the worn stone under our feet, piling in corners, like memories too stubborn to be swept away. Amos grinned, his hands resting on the railing, as if steadying himself against the weight of pride. "People notice more than you think, Lem. They saw you draw the line. Folks respect a man who does what's right even when it's hard." I nodded, taking it in, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere deep. The sun hung low, painting the steeple in gold, and the edges of the stained glass windows in fire. A small voice broke through my thoughts. "Mama, that's Mr. Lem, the houseman." A little girl tugged at her mother's hand, pointing at me with wide eyes full of curiosity. Her mother hushed her gently, but not before offering me a smile, warm enough to fight off the chill. I smiled back, tipping my hat. Inside the church, elders had shaken my hand one after another, their words simple but sincere. They praised my integrity, spoke of my father, and the legacy he'd left behind. Before I left, they asked if I'd consider reviving the old scholarship fund in his name, the one that had helped more than a few kids around here back in the day. "Think about it," Amos had said as we stepped outside. "Would be a fine thing." And I was thinking about it even as the autumn wind carried the promise of colder days ahead. That evening, Silas and Nadine joined me at the kitchen table. The kettle whistled softly as Nadine poured tea, her presence quiet but solid as always. Silas unfolded a scrap of paper covered in notes, his brow furrowed but his eyes hopeful. "We could structure it like Dad's original plan," he said, glancing at me for approval. "Small grants may be a mentoring piece too." I nodded, listening, watching him rediscover the kind of man I'd hoped he'd be. Marley kept her distance that night, hovering at the edge of the room, listening but saying little. She was still finding her footing, and that was all right. Some repairs take longer. Later, long after the house had settled into its nighttime hush, I sat at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp by the window. The steam from my coffee curled into the air, like smoke signals sent to no one in particular. I worked through the first draft of the proposal, the scratch of my pen loud in the quiet. The words came slow, careful, but they came. The next morning, I stepped outside to find Silas in the yard, bent over the old garden bench. The slats had split last winter, left forgotten through spring and summer. Now he was mending it, sanding the edges smooth, fitting the pieces together with new screws. I stood at the porch rail, watching him work, and felt something knit together in me too. The phone rang just after noon. I answered, expecting a neighbor, or maybe Amos. "Mr. Lem, this is Cray's Repair. Your watch is ready, looks good as new, sir." I held the phone a moment longer than needed, listening to the soft hum of the line, feeling the weight of what that meant. "Thank you," I said. "I'll be by tomorrow." And as I hung up, I looked out at the yard, at Silas straightening the bench, and at Nadine stepping onto the porch with fresh lemonade. Her smile easy, like we'd all come through a storm and could finally see clear skies ahead. The afternoon sun slanted low across the churchyard, casting long shadows that danced among the scattered leaves. I stood at the podium, the repaired watch in my hand, catching the light, the glass smooth once more. I turned it over, feeling the familiar weight of it, then clicked it closed with a soft snap that seemed louder in the hush. A full circle, a promise kept. The church grounds were alive with the sounds of Thanksgiving. Laughter and conversation rippled across the lawn, mingling with the crisp rustle of dry leaves skittering over the stone paths. Children's voices rang out as they chased one another, their footsteps light their joy, unself-conscious. From the open church doors floated the faint strains of an old hymn, accompanied by the scent of pumpkin pie and wood smoke that drifted from the fellowship hall. I drew in a slow breath, savoring the moment, the mingling scents, the cool air, the warmth of the sun on my face. And I thought, this is what legacy should feel like. At my feet, the podium bore scratches and nicks from years of use. Marks of service, not neglect. I rested my hands on its edge and looked out at the faces before me. Neighbors I'd known my whole life. Young families new to the community. Elders who'd taught me Sunday school, or shared fence-mending duties on long-ago afternoons. I want to thank you all for being here today. I began, voice steady, though my heart swelled with more feeling than I'd expected. This isn't just about a scholarship. It's about what we pass on. Not houses or titles or bank accounts, but the things that matter. Character, integrity. The simple belief that doing what's right matters whether anyone's watching or not. Heads nodded. I caught Amos's eye where he stood near the steps, his arms folded, pride written plain on his face. Nadine sat near the front, her hands folded in her lap. Eyes bright. Marley stood at the edge of the gathering, quieter than I'd ever seen her listening. When my father started this fund, He wasn't wealthy, not in the way folks usually mean, but he was rich in what counts. And I hope with your help, we'll carry that forward. There was no applause, just a silence filled with shared understanding, the kind that doesn't need noise to make its point. As the formalities ended, people lingered, pressing envelopes into my hand, dropping folded bills into the collection box, offering pledges of time and help. One neighbor promised to organize a mentoring night at the school. Another offered to match donations. By the end of the afternoon, the board had named it the Kavanaugh Integrity Fund. Silas approached quietly, his expression softer than I'd seen in years. The sunlight caught in his hair, and for a fleeting moment I saw the boy he'd been, the one who'd sat beside me on tractor rides and asked endless questions about how the world worked. "You taught us right, Dad," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Even when I couldn't see it, you taught us right. I'm sorry it took so long to tell you that." I placed a hand on his shoulder, let the weight of that moment settle between us. "You're telling me now, that's what counts." Marley lingered at the edge of the crowd, uncertain. I crossed the lawn to her, drew out the watch once more, and placed it in her hands. She looked down at it, surprised by its weight, tracing the smooth glass with her thumb. "Learn from it," I said quietly. "Not everything that breaks stays broken. And not everything mended looks like it did before, but it can still work just fine." Her eyes filled, and for once she had no sharp words, no defenses, just a nod, small and real. As the sun dipped lower, casting the yard in amber light, I walked the grounds. The laughter of children rose and fell around me, pure and bright, a sound that carried like a hymn on the breeze. The flag above the church fluttered steady, the breeze stirring, the scent of pies cooling on windowsills, mingled with wood smoke and fallen leaves. And I truly felt the peace of a man who had set things right as best he could, who had chosen to leave behind something worth more than deeds and dollars, a man who had redefined his legacy, not through wealth, but through worth. As the last of the autumn light slipped behind the hills, I stood beneath the old oak, the repaired watch warm in my palm, steady now like the life I'd worked to mend. The children's laughter still echoed across the churchyard, carried on the breeze with the scent of wood smoke and pie. I've learned that sometimes it takes breaking for us to see what's worth rebuilding, and that real wealth is measured not in deeds or dollars, but in the respect we earn when we stand our ground. Life hands us second chances in quiet ways if we're willing to look. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story below, and if you'd like more of these reflections, consider following along.